Okay, class. So we're going to divide this into 3 lectures with carbohydrates. This first lecture, we're going to look at glucose and glycogen utilization during exercise. We'll cover that. The next one, we'll start to look at high fructose corn syrup. And then probably a third one will be sweeteners. And then we'll talk about insoluble fibers and things like that. So what I've done, I have the slides here. You can follow along in this video, or you can have the slides however you want to do this on your own, doesn't matter. But I'm going to just go through some of the slides. I'll add some other information, again, similar to a lecture that we usually do, except obviously it's online. And so I want to start off where we ended up here with glycemic index. And here we're looking at muscle glycogen. Remember, muscle glycogen is a storage form of glucose. As we see during exercise, you can kind of see right here, this is going to drop, not surprisingly, when we exercise, which makes sense. We're using glucose, assuming we're not doing anything to take glucose in while we're exercising, then we're going to lose this glycogen. And not surprisingly, when we get towards 45 minutes, an hour, we are going to utilize a lot of muscle glycogen. All right? Now, the reason this is interesting is that if we could somehow either replace that carbohydrate, or instead of replacing it during exercise, maybe take some more before exercise, the theory would be, well, hey, would that make this better? As you can see from this graph, there's some research looking at taking in carbohydrate prior to exercise, and then blue being a placebo, not doing it, that yeah, you can keep some, a small amount, but some of the muscle glycogen. And this is where the idea of carbo loading or taking carbohydrates before exercise is really got its background from. And so a lot of you have probably done this before. A lot of you have probably, eaten pizza or pasta or things like that before a race or before a big game. Now, whether that works or not really well, we could talk about. But the theory is that, yeah, if you can form more muscle glycogen, you can almost hyper-store that yes, in theory, you can have more available during exercise. And so a couple of things I want to just kind of grasp here. In this chart, we're going to refer back to not just for this chapter, but when we talk about your nutrition analysis later on, the idea that differing activities are going to require some amount of carbohydrate recommendation. So in other words, for most of us, right, if you're engaging in normal activity, normal sports, so you can see here on this table here, most all of us taking about 5 to 7 grams per kilogram of body weight of carbohydrate per day. So if you weigh 70 kilograms and you take in 6 grams per kilogram body weight, you just multiply 6 by 70, you get 420 grams. Right? And as we all know, we can calculate how many calories that is. I won't ask you that right now, but you get the idea. And so depending on the activities, there is some differing amount of carbohydrate intake. We can see this from this slide. As we see, though, is that when we start engaging in activities that require more and more utilization of glucose, more and more breakdown of glycogen, the necessary daily intake for this becomes greater. As we see here, we can look at distance running. If we're talking like 1 to 4 hours, just in swimming, cycling, well, now we've increased to 8 to 10 grams per kilogram body weight. And we're starting to talk about triathlons. This is really someone who's training 1, 2, 3 hours a day. Well, now we've increased this carbohydrate need 8 to maybe even 19 grams per kilogram of body weight. And this is key because a lot of calories we're getting here to maintain the ability to do this activity is going to come from carbohydrate. And now, I know this goes against a lot of the low carb diet and all that. We'll talk about that later on. But the idea here being that, yeah, you need carbohydrate at least on a daily basis to be able to maintain these types of activities. And again, these tables, they are in the back of your book. You can look at those there. I think these are in chapter 4 of your book as well. I'm not going to ask you to memorize these. I'm not going to ask you on a test, how many grams per kilogram body weight does moderate intensity exercise require. But I have a sense that there is a scale here depending on the person's activity. And this is key because when you do your nutrition analysis, you're going to have people who vary in their carbohydrate need depending on how active they are, what activities they're engaging in. And so we have to keep that in mind when we're making recommendations for them that, hey, they may have they may be really active, may not be active, and that'll adjust the carbohydrate intake. Okay, so to give you an idea, there's just some differences there. Now this gets us to, okay, so what about activity? How much should you take in? When should you do it? Is there a right food to take? Is there a wrong food to take? And so we're just going to, based on research, look at some recommendations. And again, these are from your book, but at least give us a starting point to say, okay, when it comes to carbohydrates, what's really the best before, during, and after way to do this? So when we talk about prior to exercise, and really right here, the big thing here is a rule of thumb tends to be that we want to take in 1 gram per kilogram of body weight of carbohydrate 1 hour prior to exercise. And if it's 2 hours, it's 2 grams, so on and so forth. So in theory, if someone's engaging in, I don't know, a soccer game, basketball game, or 10K or things like that, that we want to take in at least 1 gram of carbohydrate per kilogram body weight just to be able to maintain glycogen stores for that activity. Now, a lot of things are going to affect this. Obviously, the type of activity, the person, their body weight, sure, those are issues. Obviously, also the form of this, and this tends to be more trial and error thing. For some people, it's going to be high pasta, those types of foods. For others, maybe not tolerating that so well, that may be a little bit different. This obviously is where sport drinks often come into play, Gatorade, Powerade, things like that. We'll talk about those more during exercise. But here, we're talking about just getting carbohydrates in prior to activity. Okay, so that's prior. Well, let's talk about during, because during is a little bit different. During you're thinking, well, come on, that shouldn't be a big deal, right? Before is fine. Well, in longer activities, generally activities longer than an hour, even pre-carbohydrate ingestion will not be enough to stop glycogen stores from severely dropping. And so because of that, then usually the cutoff line is about 45 minutes to an hour. For me, it's about an hour to say, okay, there needs to be some carbohydrate then taken in. And so the recommendation, something along the lines of 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour. The big issue here, obviously, is, well, how do you do that? If you've ever engaged in an event like a half marathon or a triathlon, taking in that much carbohydrate is not easy. It's not advisable to eat spaghetti or a potato in mile 10 of a marathon. So how do you do that? And this is where bars, chewy bars, not protein bars, but those kind of easily eaten things, gels, goo, which we talked about before, Powerade, a lot of these drinks that are rich in glucose and fructose. This is where these probably more so come into play. High glycemic index foods, reabsorbed very quickly, again, to hopefully stem off some of the drop in muscle glycogen. And again, a lot of these are trial and error, depending on the individual, depending on, honestly, what they can stomach and what they're able to do. And this can be key. When it comes to long distance events, the ability to keep carbohydrates during activity may be one of the biggest factors to success. Okay. And these are some tables here. These are from your book, so don't feel like you have to memorize these. Don't do that. But let's give you some idea of what's in some of these, whether they're different bars, Gatorades, things like that. Gives you some idea what's in these, serving size, kilocalories, sugar, whether they have high fructose corn syrup, which we'll talk about, and then some of the basic carbohydrate and even fiber intake. Okay, so that's before, that's during. What about after? You may think, well, after, who cares about after? After I'm done, I lay down, I'm good. Well, understand, after activity, we still have an increase in metabolic rate. And we all get this because if you've run a marathon, or if you've had a 2-hour practice or something like that, even after the practice, you're tired, your heart rate is still up, blood pressure is still up, different increasing metabolic rate. Because of that, you still need to take in carbohydrate. On top of the fact, your probably muscle glycogen levels are already too low to where we have to restore those back to normal. And so basic rule here is we need to take some amount of carbohydrate in after activity. Now, the guideline here is about 1.5 grams per kilogram body weight in the first hour. Again, this can vary a little bit depending on the activity. One other key thing here, which we'll get to later on when we talk about proteins, is the need to add proteins to part of this. We're going to assume that in a longer duration activity, there was some amount of amino acids being used. We were breaking down some proteins in order to utilize to form ATP, and so we have to replace those. And so we'll get to that amino acids later on. We'll talk about amino acid supplements in a couple weeks. But here may be a part where we want to add in some protein to deal with that. Okay, so we've talked about pre, before, after. Well, let's get to the timing of it. What's the best way to do this? Do you do it 3 hours before? Do you do it the day before? And the classic loading has always been, and this model kind of shows it. You work really, really hard. You take a couple of days off. You work really, really hard. Take a couple of days off, and in those windows of time off, you increase carbohydrate intake, and that's great. The problem with this model is no one's going to do this. No one has the luxury of taking 2-3 days off at a time, at least not in most sports we engage in. It's because of that this classical model, though it works great, really isn't appropriate. And so this gets us more to what we call a taper or a modified model, where over a week before a large, important activity, a marathon, a time trial, whatever, we are slowly decreasing the exercise, but increasing carbohydrate intake. And therefore, by the time you get to this, we've carbo-loaded, we've increased glycogen stores as much as we can, we've tapered physically, but not to a point where we're losing fitness, and you're able to have adequate glycogen stores, in this model case, by day 7. Now, this is one way to do it. Obviously, even this can be difficult. A lot of activities don't work on this kind of schedule. You might have 2-3 games a week, maybe sometimes 2 in a day, and so we have to modify this a little bit. But irregardless, and what we want to grasp here is that, whatever we can do to keep muscle glycogen stores as high as possible. And this goes for any activity, endurance running, strength training, whatever sport. The need to have muscle glycogen, stored glucose to form ATP is essential. And so as we see here, even in just through training, and this is an example of how just simply training day in, day out, we're going to lose glycogen, we're going to lose stored glycogen, and just making an effort to replace that can have a huge effect on performance. Next slide, we're going to talk about high fructose corn syrup. We'll talk about 1974, why, although the 70s was awful fashion, it was a great year. Well, if you're high fructose corn syrup, it was a great year. And we'll tackle that on the next slide, on the next video.